Okay, there's a bunch of you in, so we'll get started. So thanks for coming today. I'm Maria Colacurcio. I'm the CEO of Syndio. Many of you have come to our webinars before, but if this is your first one, welcome. As always, we have a great set of panelists and experts to talk with you all today. And I think the topic is very, very pressing and pertinent. I'm hearing so many of our customers bring this topic up as I'm going across the country and meeting with different folks, particularly in comp, but also across HR, generally speaking, and DEI in particular. So let's go through just a couple of housekeeping things at the beginning. So we love questions. One of the things that I think makes these webinars so popular and so successful is that we really do try to get through your questions. We don't save them all for the end. I pepper them in and ask them of the panelists. So please feel free to use either the chat function or the Q&A function, depending on whether you want to be anonymous or not. We like to give both options and ask questions all the time, as much as you want, all through the thing. You don't have to wait until the official Q&A at the end, because we'll just kind of roll the whole thing as a conversation. The way this works is we'll do a couple of slides after the intro to kind of level set on the topic, and then we'll move right into the discussion. So we'll take the slides down and you'll just see our faces, and we hope it feels like a conversation that you're also, pulling up a chair and chatting with us too. So that's the way that we like to do this. So we hope that you can join us, and please feel free to ask questions. So let's talk about the topic and let's talk about our panelists. So we have three incredible panelists today here talking with us about how to develop a more equitable performance management program. And as we all know, performance management is a critical component of an effective human capital strategy. And what we want to focus on today is how do you use that to drive better business outcomes, because that's really the intent when this is done well. And what I'm hearing in the chatter that's happening right now is, I'll go to a dinner with customers and I'll have one customer on one side saying they're throwing out performance management, they're throwing out reviews. And then on my left, there will be another customer saying they're instating or reinstating a performance management process. So I think people are coming from all across the board trying to figure out what to do here, because traditional approaches are kind of this breeding ground for bias. So we're trying to figure out how to create that equitable program, and also one that's tied to business performance. So our speakers today, first we have Elizabeth Roseman. She's the head of total rewards at Corebridge Financial. Elizabeth was previously the life and retirement, or Corebridge was previously the life and retirement business of AIG before its IPO. And at Corebridge, Elizabeth is responsible for the company's compensation philosophy and employee value proposition, including design, development, and maintenance of market-aligned salary structures, incentive plans, benefit plans, retention strategies, all the things. I mean, this list, I could go on and on. And before that, before Corebridge / AIG, she was the head of comp at Merck and Company, and before that, the head of exec comp at Allergen. She also served as assistant general counsel at Goldman Sachs, where she counseled on legal and disclosure implications of exec comp. So huge wealth of knowledge here if you didn't get that from all those qualifications, not only in comp, but also exec comp and legal. So make sure you get your questions in. Next, we have Courtney Benjamin, who's the head of diversity, equity, inclusion at Bungie. And she has a 2-decade-plus career in HR, spanning nonprofit, tech, university, and now games, which is probably a fun place to land. She's the head of ID&E for Bungie. It's a game studio in Bellevue, Washington, my hometown. So shout out to that. And she's responsible for creating the vision and strategy for an equitable now and future. Courtney is a really interesting voice on this in this conversation, and I love that we have sort of three different perspectives: the comp perspective, the HR perspective, and the DEI perspective, because Courtney is also a real thought leader and serves as a strategic partner to all the functions as it relates to her work at Bungie. She's a 3-time graduate of Washington State University, so for all those Cougars out there, if there's any of them, and a huge sports fan and loves audiobooks. So Courtney, thank you so much for being here. And last but certainly not least is Lynn Moffett. Lynn Moffett is the VP of HR at BMC Software. And BMC, if you haven't heard of them, they're a stalwart and a global leader in innovative software solutions. She has responsibility over the global business partner rewards and payroll organization. So again, you're getting three really interesting perspectives on this call today. She's also got over 2 decades of experience in HR and people. And I know Lynn personally, spent time with her in April as well as Courtney. And just all three of these women are so passionate about creating and supporting an inclusive work experience. So Lynn originally joined BMC in 2011 as the director of benefits and progressed to the senior director of compensation and benefits and area vice president, and then was promoted to vice president. So she worked as SVP of human resources at PaySafe Group before rejoining BMC, because she was there, left and rejoined. And is also a board member for a couple different organizations, financial services and nonprofit. So Lynn, thank you so much for being here. Really, really excited to have all of you. You can see we just have a powerhouse. Okay, so let's get into just some overview stuff. So first of all, who the heck are we? Why are we hosting these webinars? So Syndio is a workplace equity platform. So we provide solutions to enterprise companies to help them analyze and resolve pay and opportunity gaps that are because of something like gender, race, ethnicity. And we also have a pretty stellar expert support team that helps our customers out as they do this work. So looking at things like, are your performance reviews biased, is right in the wheelhouse of what we do. So that's who Syndio, that's who we are. And let's get into it. So we're going to do 2 quick polls. So the first question is, does your company have a formal performance management process? So just give us an answer, and that'll help us kind of tailor our conversation. And then Caitlin, just give me a shout when I can move on. Okay, I think we're good on that one. There we go. Okay, so the answers, I think it's always fun to see the answers, so I'll share them with you. I actually don't know if you can see them, but it looks like 90% of you do have a formal performance management process. So that's great. Let's move on to number 2. So if yes, so 90% of you said yes, so that's good. 90% of you will be able to answer question 2. Do you believe your company's performance management process is effective and fair? So we'll get some answers to that, and then we'll get into the guts. I love all the intros in the chat. Keep those coming. Those are great. Keep telling us about who you are and where you come from. Okay, so a little more split on this one. So 49% of you say yes, our process is effective and fair, and 51% of you say no, our process is not effective and fair. So great to know. That's going to help us kind of tailor this conversation. And just as a reminder, you now know all about your panelists and their background, so please feel free to throw questions in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to talk for as few minutes as possible because I really want to get to the conversation, but to set the stage, let's show a little bit of the data and research that's been coming out in earnest over the past 6 to 12 months on performance management. So number one, nearly all companies have a formal performance management process, but just like our audience here, where 51% of you said it's not effective and fair, we would assume that you're saying, you know, the presumption of not effective means you're probably a little bit dissatisfied with it. So you're not alone. It looks like 80% of folks have redesigned their performance management process in the last 4 years alone. So a couple other data points. Most companies are still leveraging a rating scale, but the enforcement is really inconsistent. And I think that's something you're going to hear as we jump into the discussion. But these are interesting stats to set the stage in terms of who even has performance distribution targets. You've got the percentages there on the right, and then on the left, you can see what's the approach. Using ratings, using 2-point scale, 4-point, 6-point, it's all over the board. So I think this is really telling a story that this is inconsistent and companies are still trying to figure out how do they move from what they were doing to something new. So a report that came out yesterday from I4CP that was really interesting. It was mostly a study on productivity and hybrid work and how that's working and what the perception is across executives and workers. But there were some interesting stats sandwiched in there around performance management and the processes and how they can lead to bias and distrust. So I'm not going to read these all for you. We will share the deck afterwards, but you can see that there is, 9 of 10 human resource leaders don't believe annual performance reviews result in accurate information. Only 15% of women and 24% of men managers had confidence in their performance evaluation. So when we look at this combined with the I4CP study on trust and the importance of trust in creating productivity, there's some real work to be done here. Okay, so with that, the stage is set. We know that 51% of you do not believe your performance process is effective or fair. So let's jump in. I'm going to throw the first question out to the panel. So this one can sort of be to any and all of you, whoever wants to answer. There have been repeated movements to abolish performance reviews over the past 2 decades. And one of the arguments for that has been that they're very subjective. So performance reviews can breed bias, they're subjective. I'm curious to know, to just kick it off as a little warm-up question, what are the biggest pros and cons of maintaining a formal process, and embed in there in your answer, speaking really to this 51% of our audience that doesn't believe their processes are effective or fair. So what are the pros and cons of maintaining a formal process? And who wants to be brave? Who wants to start?
I'll go ahead and start.
Awesome. Thanks, Lynn.
All right. Well, so, it's interesting in terms of the overall data, because, I too get very much the sense, even in the tech industry, that having a formal ratings process is still the more predominant version of how we go and approach trying to measure our overall business outcomes for the year. And even though there was a huge push a few years back in terms of going ratingless, right? And that was a huge trend. And I think a lot of companies did take a serious look at it in terms of whether or not they wanted to go down that path. And I think that helped to potentially crystallize where the pros and cons are of the current process. And there's also some pros and cons of going ratingless as well. So as I think about, the pros of maintaining a formal performance management process, I think, Maria, you hit on the overall outcomes correctly, right? It truly is to drive the right business outcomes. At the end of the day, if you are tying in, and if you're talking about your company strategy and you're creating your goals for the year out of that company strategy, and then you're measuring how those goals are actually being performed throughout the year, and you're measuring those results at the end of the year, you should actually be driving the right business outcomes, and everybody should be moving along to the same page and the same course and speed. And you're certainly having that formal process allows everyone to assess how well did we do during the year. It requires managers to go through that very formalized process of thinking and then actually applying that to the individuals who contributed to that overall outcome. And we know that not everyone contributes to those overall outcomes in the same way. And so the formal process says that, there is going to be differentiation here. There's likely a small group that are going to be outstanding performers who likely are going to be driving quite a bit of the work and the progress you make throughout the year. Then there's going to be your core set of folks who are driving a lot of the work, and they continue to be successful, and meeting expectations is absolutely a successful outcome. That's important to remember. And then there are the people that, maybe they're not quite in the right role, or they're struggling with their current role and where they are. And we need to make sure that we're providing that right guidance to them. And so having that formal process does provide that structure to managers in terms of how to have those conversations and to make sure that on a periodic basis, we are having those conversations. Now, the cons are, it can be incredibly time intensive. So if you're doing it right and you're having those more periodic conversations, there is a lot of work for managers to do. And it's why sometimes a lot of that work and those conversations tend to get piled up towards the very end of the year, when sometimes even then the plate for the managers gets even more full, right? If you're not trying to tackle that, throughout the year. Also, we also know that there can absolutely be bias on those overall performance ratings, especially when potentially you've got different goals that maybe aren't as objective or as measurable. So, there are some roles and there are some parts of the organization where you can absolutely concretely measure out a specific business outcome. But it can be difficult to sometimes assess how much did that person drive towards that business outcome. You typically don't have as good measurement tools out there. This is not an area that has been digitized quite as well, although, again, your systems and your frameworks do help to managers to get through this process. But I think we could go and evolve here in leaps and bounds and really help managers take some of the lift off. So that's absolutely one of the cons. And, in terms of the bias, you can have different ratings biases in terms of recency bias. So our managers really kind of taking maybe what the last few months of the year were like with that person, and then giving them a full rating for the entire year based on that. You can have other types of biases creeping up there. Maybe in general, they do 3 out of 5 things excellently, but 2 out of the 5 are not done well. Well, maybe the 3 out of the 5 are more important to that manager and they give them an outstanding rating, but really maybe it should be a bit more balanced. So you've got to be taking a look through all of those different things, but those can really be the cons of any performance management system. And then of course, there is the emotional reaction to the label at the end of the day by the employee. So nobody loves to hear that they're meeting expectations. And I think that that's a part of just the educational system that we grow up in, right? An A student is somebody who's an outstanding performer. And you've got a lot of people in our organizations that were A students, B students, right? C students, it connotates something a little bit different than really what meets expectations should be. So you can have that emotional reaction, and then sometimes that can hamper the really honest and good feedback and the conversations that managers and employees need to be having.
Thank you, Lynn. That's a great start. I mean, I think a couple of things jumped out at me. One thing, we have to be really clear about ratings versus reviews, because they're often conflated, and many companies have kicked ratings to the curb, but they're still doing reviews. And then you mentioned a pain point that's very, very clear. It's the calibration, because it's such a painful process. So I want to kick it to Courtney and Elizabeth to hit us with the pros and cons. Which one of you wants to go next?
I will go. I think my take might be different than Elizabeth's, but we'll see. Because the way that I'm coming to this from being an ID&E practitioner and having very recently gone through the performance, our performance season, which we have actually twice a year at Bungie. So the way that I look at this is, from a pro perspective, because I did a lot of the training around biases and bias reduction throughout the performance review season. I would say that it provides a lot of opportunity for the organization to take kind of a look at itself and see where we still have gaps in our understanding of subjectivity and our humanness personally. I think it provides an opportunity for the organization and for the humans in the organization to really work on those key capabilities of what it takes to reduce that bias and kind of do that self-work. I think that from a con perspective, and this is what we're kind of dealing with, is manager capability, right? And not just how managers show up in their responsibility in this process, but there's a lot of I would say ways to reduce bias throughout the process, and I don't think that managers are trying to be insidious when that creeps in. We're just human beings. But I think that the performance management review season helps keep the organization honest, helps keep human beings honest, and really work on those things that are not just, we don't just utilize these skills during performance review. This should be a daily thing, a moment by moment thing. And so really calling attention to that, I think is truly important. I love how you mentioned, Lynn, the rating list, like we're rating lists as well. We don't provide ratings. This is really an opportunity for the organization, again, to calibrate how we're doing against the larger organizational goals. But we are so, as a gaming studio, we are so incredibly human-centered. And the discussions that we have are highly, highly development-focused. It's yes, performance is kind of a backward looking, but we are very intentional about the forward looking as well. And I think that's another pro and another intentionality that we need to ensure it's part of the process.
Thank you, Courtney. Great to hear your two perspectives since you have different areas of from the practitioner perspective. Elizabeth, what do you think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I'm a proponent of a formal process because I think that it's very easy to let it fall by the wayside if you say this is just part of the manager's job. We all know managers don't always get to everything they should get to. So I think having a formal process provides that opportunity for reflection that Courtney and Lynn spoke about. And it is an opportunity for development. I think that there are a lot of opportunities in that setting to provide good feedback on not only the results, what someone achieved during the year, but how they achieved it. And I think the performance reviews that I've found most useful are the opportunities to help people reflect on their behaviors, how they show up in the workplace, and the ways in which they can continue to develop and grow. So I think performance reviews have a real purpose. The cons are, as you noted, anytime someone has an opportunity to reflect in general, unconscious bias can creep in. And I think, Courtney, you're right that the antidote to unconscious bias is active inclusion. We have the opportunity to retrain during these processes managers to refresh them on places where their unconscious bias may be creeping in. And I think that we can continue to use data and analytics more and more as we progress. I think there's a lot of untapped potential in that data to help managers see the places where they don't think they're being biased, but we may be able to identify it through data and over time and really have them have even more reflection moments when they're writing their reviews and even considering who they ask to review them if you have a 360 structure.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So the chat's blowing up, which I love to see. So thank you everyone for asking questions. I'm going to throw in a chat question from the audience because I think this one is, and then I'm going to move to another topic that's clearly getting a lot of interest, just like how do you deal with throwing out ratings? But first, I want to start with this one because we're seeing a lot of questions pop up that reflect this theme. So I'm going to read it, and then whoever wants to take a stab, let's give it a stab, and feel free to, where appropriate, use anecdotes of what you all are doing or have experienced at different companies across your career, because we're getting some questions about that too, just like specific anecdotes. So this is the question. It says, we struggle to balance financial incentives and recognize high performers due to budget limitation. In turn, employees struggle to see how their performance is tied to merit increases. What recommendations would you have to combat a challenge like this? So I think it's around like the employees aren't seeing how the performance is tied to their merit increase. So any thoughts or experiences or anecdotes on this one that anyone wants to jump in and answer?
I'll definitely jump in. The comp is my passion. I think that you hit it. The person asked that question. There's always the challenge that if you've got a net neutral budget scheme, how do you demonstrate to your high performers without having to really penalize the mighty middle, which are going to be those that meet expectations. And so I think it's twofold. With merit, I often recommend not focusing your pay for performance strategy on merit. It's the law of small numbers. If you've got 3% or 3.5% or 2.5%, you're going to spend a lot of energy to not make a meaningful difference for a colleague, and they won't then see it. So I tend to focus that pay for performance linkage in the variable pay, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of alignment of your senior leadership team. Everyone wants to say they're pay for performance, but do you really mean it? And are you really ready to deliver below target amounts to folks that either didn't meet expectations, partially met, or even for those that fully met, but they didn't perhaps in the behaviors show up quite the way you wanted to? And that takes time, and it is a really challenging strategy. One anecdote of what has worked well at one of the companies I've worked at before is proximity. So that time bias, having a mechanism in your pay for performance strategy for quick recognitions of good performance or good behavior. We found that worked extremely well, allowing managers or peers throughout the organization to recognize, even with small dollar values, good work and good performance. We also had a system at that company where we aggregated all of those recognition moments and all of those messages and feedback points throughout the year, and it kind of pre-populated part of the annual performance review cycle. And we found that was so powerful. It eliminated, Lynn, to your point, that immediacy bias at the year end. It also gave managers an opportunity to see, wow, I remember all of that good work throughout the year and they're being recognized by their peers. we found that the quantum of the incentive wasn't as important as the proximity and frequency.
And, I'll just go ahead and jump in here. And I would completely agree that your variable pay incentives are really the best place to drive overall pay for performance. Now, in terms from a merit cycle perspective, we are a multinational company. In different countries, you're going to have different pay budgets. And so in some countries, it can be a bit easier to do some further differentiation. What I would say in terms of best practices is, one, just simply giving your managers that guidance from a merit matrix perspective, having them input it into a system, getting everybody, and look, that this goes from a pay equity perspective, why we are getting everybody onto one cycle. So you're reviewing everyone consistently across the board. But typically your merit matrices will have a lower amount if you are higher in the comp ratio and you have lower performance, and vice versa. So there is a little bit of differentiation going on there. What I would also say too is, don't be afraid to put the barriers or the hard stops in your system. So both on variable pay, so enforcing a payment range based on the rating ultimate outcome, rather than having to have the time to have conversations with HR business partners going back to the business. Do that enforcement mechanism, but give some overlap, give some judgment, and also, again, as a compensation professional, make sure you do have some sort of outside process, right? So if there's a good reason for an exception, make sure you have an exception process in place. The business partners know it, they're going through it, and you have that within your own team. Also, long-term incentives tend to be also another good vehicle to help differentiate on pay for performance. So I would say that your variable, your short-term, and your long-term are where we would look first in terms of those pieces.
It's a great discussion. I mean, the chat is absolutely blowing up right now about ratings. I think what we see across our customers, and we'll segue into the next question, but first, Courtney, I want to get your perspective on the rating lists and merit tie and all of that first. But the companies who have eliminated ratings, it really emphasizes that you actually have to have more performance conversations. And I think, Elizabeth, this speaks to what you said, like, it's not a once a year thing. And what we find with our customers, because we are an analytics platform, so to the question that was posed to Elizabeth, we do this all the time in our software platform, analyzing performance ratings and seeing if there's bias in the ratings. And we often find weak or no relationship between pay and performance, regardless of ratings or other things. So I think it's, because most employees aren't seeing the connection between performance and merit, and we personally across our customers see a weak relationship between those two. A lot of companies are starting to realize this and are eliminating them. And then from there, they're making merit a function of location, range, tenure, level. They're starting to figure out different things in order to drive that. So Courtney, would love your perspective, because again, you're coming in with a different lens from the DEI perspective. So what are your thoughts on kind of rating lists, the tie between performance and merit? What are you seeing and what have you experienced in your companies?
Yeah, so we are not paid for performance. To your last point, Maria, we have figured out, so our full HR team, including our performance management process, we're constantly iterating on, but this past year, I think we've done a lot of work using Syndio and using the platform and kind of getting that data that we've been receiving to make tweaks that we feel are leading more towards that kind of equitable perspective across the board. So we're not paid for performance. We actually have opened up this year. We're getting ready to go into another kind of season of opening up to the studio the opportunity to promote folks. What we have in the fall is market adjustments. So no paid for performance, but we have market adjustments in the fall. And then we have 4 times a year now, we're moving into that, where managers can choose to promote folks on their team. And then that, of course, is where folks could get a bump in their salary or in their pay. Anytime that there's a performance adjustment or move across the organization, we feed that data back into the Syndio platform, because we really want to ensure, as we're making these movements and these small adjustments, that there's no adverse impact across the organization. And that can easily happen. You can have a manager who says, okay, I didn't promote these 3 people on my team, but looking at the demographic factors, as well as what that will do in order to increase people's pay, what that will do to the entire system. So I think that's really important as well, is looking at every single movement you make across the organization and how that is how that's impacting the organization, almost on a moment to moment, or each time you do a pay action. I think is also really important.
Thanks, Courtney. And yeah, so thank you for the shout out, because at Syndio, I think what's interesting about the platform is we show our customers what they're actually paying for. So customers can then map their processes to their reality. So if you say you're paid for performance, but we find via the analytics in the software, it shows you that tenure, level, time and role, and other measurables are actually driving performance, you can tailor your talk track for your folks to the realities of how you're measuring the comp working or not working. So I think it's really important to understand, what are you actually paying for? And that was one of the follow-up questions in the chat, was sort of, is the weak relationship we see across our customers attributed to having too many above average performers? And sometimes yes, and more than that. Or there's a ton of average ratings. There's a bunch of stuff going on, but you've got to have those data and analytics to be able to figure it out. So I'm going to go to one of our planned questions and then jump back into the chat, because there's a question around like people management. How do you get your folks prepared to talk about this, which I think is really interesting. But first, I want to spend a little bit of time here, because it's coming up again and again. How do we move these away from subjectivity to objectivity, and what role can these analytics play in making this possible? We've talked a little bit about this, but any other thoughts on that? Because there's a lot of folks asking that question and follow-up questions around that.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here as well, Maria. One of the things that I think we overlook initially when looking at data, you can take the outputs and say, okay, here was the ratings, or here was the amount of pay. But I think there's a lot of power in natural language in uncovering some of this unconscious bias. So one of the companies I worked at did a presentation after the review cycle that just gave statistics about how frequently a particular word was used, more often than in another type of review. So the word bubbly was used at a 10x factor in reviews of females than males. There were other examples like that. And I think having that reflection moment of, wow, it's not just the outputs of the data, but if performance reviews are subjective and there's words, then let's look at the words. That company went on to implement a tool that before the review was submitted had a natural language add-in. So as you were typing your reviews, if there was a word that had been identified as being one, it would just give a moment of reflection before it was submitted, so that the manager could say, actually, is that what I mean? Let me think about that. And giving that data point, I think, was really helpful. So I don't want to overlook the importance of language as a data point for us to look at as we progress this. And then to the other question of how do you make the review cycle feel less subjective? I really enjoyed when one of the systems that was in place at a company where it gave lots of questions on like a 10-point scale, a behavior-based question. And then it didn't feel like it was just a script where someone is writing out. It gave a number, it was 10 questions of behaviors where they rated. And then it, as part of the output, it not only identified your average scores, but it showed those. You did a self-assessment where your self-assessment was the most statistically different from how others viewed you. And I thought that was a really insightful way to give you your own blind spots through the performance review process. So those are two anecdotes of what I've seen that I thought worked well.
That's great. Thank you. Other thoughts on that? And Elizabeth, everyone in the chat is saying, great point on the bias piece and the language piece. I think that's really important. As we think about kind of closing out this topic of embedding data and analytics into performance view, like what gaps currently exist, what needs to be addressed? Lynn, Courtney, any other thoughts on sort of this topic in general?
I would love to jump in, and Lynn, if you have a burning thought, please, you can cut me off, because I think folks love to say this, right? That Courtney, you bring up such spicy, thoughts here. I have talked to the organization about the fact that objectivity is not a thing. I think we know that it's just not a thing. We'd love to think that we can reach some form of objectivity either by looking at numbers, looking at data, removing names or whatnot. Elizabeth, I think you absolutely pointed out that just by the sheer fact that we are communicative, human beings, right? We use words. There's bias in even our words that we say, that we speak, even what I'm speaking today, and what we type. So objectivity truly is not necessarily a thing. It is meant to signify the reduction of bias, right? But because we're humans, we have biases. That's just the plain and simple of it. The way that we have chosen to reduce, right, the subjectivity within performance ratings. Again, I think I stated to keep it very development focused. We really want to ensure that as managers focusing on the person and their goals, right? It's less about us talking as managers, but listening to what the goals and the successes of your direct report is wanting to share, and your job as a manager is to kind of assist them through that. The feedback that you provide them is meant to be for the greater good, and we want that to be known at the very beginning. The other piece I would say is to maintain that future focused approach. Again, performance reviews are backward looking, but there are ways that you can keep that future focused approach and put that into future development plans. And then the third, and I think we mentioned it as well, is just those calibration meetings, which of course can be breeding grounds for bias. And that's why we spend so much time talking about that and ensuring that there's that those reflective moments. We did, and I think Maria, you might ask a question about this here shortly, but we learned something this year. We had a step in our process that again was meant to kind of do that bias reduction and get closer to that objectivity, where we had a step that was oh my gosh, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'll think of it in a moment. But it was meant to, once the calibration meetings are done, the manager and the employee were to meet again and to further discuss what was discussed in those calibration meetings, essentially offering a moment for the employee to say, that's interesting, or here's not necessarily a rebuttal, but here's my view on that. And it's the alignment meeting. Another opportunity to record within that alignment meeting what happens into the system. We found that some managers did that and some did not. And even that one piece of data, knowing that some managers went ahead, recorded that alignment meeting and others did not, that introduced bias. So we're learning something every single time we have our performance reviews. So I think that is just to say that there's no real way to get to, okay, everything's fair, everything's final, we're doing our very best. It's kind of an iterative process, and that's all part of design anyway, because I work in a game studio, that's one of my things. But I think it's really important that again, that we're having these conversations, that it's something that is not just assumed, that we truly talk about it, we reflect on it, and we find different ways within just ourselves and how we're enacting the performance review. And how that ties to the larger organization. It's an awesome time to keep that reflection going.
Courtney, I love that. And I think so much of what you each are saying also reminds me of the fact that when we give merit based as a percentage, this means that pay is a product of where you start. And so if your company's philosophy is kind of start low, stay low, there's going to be a ton of issues with that. So one of our solutions is called Pay Finder, and it gives recommendations on not only competitive pay based on market, but it also looks at what are your existing folks making and how do you make those pay for starting hires promotions, how do you make those fair and equitable? And I think it's really important in the context of performance reviews, because again, merit as a percentage of where you start. If I start here and Bob starts here, I have to outperform Bob for years just to catch up. And even if I outperform Bob every year for 7 years, I probably maybe am just even or a tiny bit ahead after 7 or 8 years. So I think how you set pay is almost more important than ratings when it comes to fairness and how we think about being equitable, because it takes you so long to catch up. Lynn, I want to pose the next question to you and then kind of move into a topic of around sort of people managers and things like that. So managers play such a big role in the performance management process, and we're getting a lot of questions about how can HR leaders ensure managers are properly trained? How do we make sure they have sufficient bandwidth to execute the performance management in a way that aligns with the policies? Meaning now we've used data to figure out why we actually pay what we pay. How do we prepare and train our managers? So I want to start with you and then give Courtney and Elizabeth a chance to talk about maybe some strategies that you've seen work before, but there's a lot of questions in the chat about like, how do we prepare this group of folks?
And it's probably one of the most important drivers of whether or not this process actually works well or not is how well do you prepare your managers and how often are you communicating with them? And the short answer is I would communicate with them early and often and break it up into chunks. So again, if you think about the typical manager's day, they are dealing with a myriad of different things. They're tackling different business problems throughout the year. And it can be really difficult if they let this work stack up throughout the year and they don't tackle it until the very end. And so, what I would recommend is that you bring in the education, the information. It's not just a once a year, 1 hour training that is, maybe also a little bit boring and dry. But think about your natural touch points that you have with managers when you talk about career, when you talk about opportunity. We have a monthly manager essentials phone call where we talk about a lot of different topics. So it only runs about 45 minutes long. Each topic maybe about 5 to 10 minutes in length. And we're talking about what is happening right now in the calendar that managers should be thinking about, right? And we're helping ourselves to reinforce a lot of aspects of the people calendar, also other areas from a business perspective, and we allow for open Q&A. And that is a really helpful reinforcement tool, and it allows managers to react real time to the data and what we're talking about. Of course, actual training itself is important. The interaction that your business partners have with their teams as well, driving the accountability throughout the manager population, incredibly important. So again, as we talk about data and analytics, just some of the really simple data and analytics that are important for us to take a look at is whether or not goals are being set, whether or not managers are actually using the feedback tools or not. I mean, these are really simple things that we can make sure that our managers actually doing those activities in the time frame that we think is helpful for them as well as for their employees. And then we also use a device called Prioritize People Week, where every single quarter we set time on the calendar for managers to think about and actually give them an opportunity to concentrate on certain tasks that are important to driving the performance management as well as the development management process. So we do talk about both things in tandem. So as Courtney has talked quite a bit about, but they are two separate processes. So you want to talk about performance management, how well are employees actually doing against goals, getting feedback, but then also making sure that you are driving development for them as well and talking about the future forward state. So we do set that time out. It is not official. It's not put on to the official calendars, but we do actually put dates out there so that managers, again, can use that more as a reminder device. Hey, I need to actually get this done in this quarter. Otherwise, again, a lot of this won't happen. It'll pile up on me. So I think those are some of the ways that you can tackle within your own organization and maybe make it a little bit less heavy, because that's also important too. The other thing besides manager communications is I think technology will help give us a huge lift here. And I saw some of the comments in the chat around generative AI. I think this is an area ripe for AI to help us automate in a better way. Also for us to just simply synthesize all of this information. There's a lot of great information in a lot of our performance management systems, but there is no way that I can potentially, read through, 5,000 performance evaluations. No one person can and actually synthesize what is it actually telling us. but it is a treasure trove of data. And I think organizations could really get a lot out of it, but it's going to take AI and it's going to take a different technology in order for us to really harness that and again, help ultimately improve our business outcomes, which is where we want to go with this process.
Thanks, Lynn. Elizabeth, Courtney, thoughts on how you prepare your management layer for these conversations, whether you're rating lists or you have ratings or you have merit or you're doing the calibrations, like walk us through what you've seen succeed.
I mean, mine's a pretty short answer, Courtney, and then I'll turn it over to you. I think we just need to be laser focused on clarity, consistency, and simplicity. I think at times we over-engineer these processes. We create too much reliance and burden on managers, and then we're surprised that it was garbage out. And I think if instead at every turn, whether it's the training, the communications, the design, you're thinking about how could I make it clearer to managers what the purpose is of this exercise, what value it holds, that's going to help. Consistency, making sure that what you say, Maria, to your point, you say you pay for performance, but you don't really. Consistency, if you want to drive a result, then you have to build tools that support it and then reflect on the data to check yourself. And then in terms of simplicity, I think there's a lot there, Lynn, that you said about technology. There's a lot that we can continue to lean on technology. We've got to make it easier for managers to do these HR tasks so that they don't really fail to give it the energy and the enthusiasm that it deserves. But in terms of training content against bias, Courtney, I'd really look to you. You have much more expertise here in how to design effective trainings.
That's great. I love that. I'm such a proponent of like, what are the 3 key words? And I love that: clear, consistent, and simple, or clear, consistency, and simplicity. I love that. I'm going to steal that too, Elizabeth. You know, but the key word, and I wrote this down. I was talking to our talent leader about this webinar today. And I asked her, I said, what is, if I were to go on there, and where's one thing that you would love for me to highlight for everyone when it comes to performance management? What is that one key thing for you? And she said manager capability. And I think we're talking about this, just manager capability. This is something that has been highlighted in our surveys time and time again. It's something that we're working on. The organization, the studio, hasn't necessarily had good tools for training, for helping managers, and in fact, the entire studio understand what good feedback looks like, sounds like, feels like. And we know that during the performance review season, it's all about feedback. It's all about giving feedback, receiving feedback, providing feedback. And if you don't have that capability, Elizabeth, to your point, garbage in, garbage out, right? I would really encourage everyone out there to concentrate on that middle, concentrate on the capabilities of your managers and having them understand what good feedback looks like. And not only to give it, but to receive it. I think there's a lot of us who say, oh, I love feedback. Feedback is a gift. Give me more feedback. There's so many cases where folks are not good at taking feedback. And that's okay too, right? It's a feedback sometimes, although it's a gift, it's sometimes hard to take. And that's fine. But the more we practice it, the more we build our capability around feedback, I think the better it is for everyone. And again, another area that we can practice in order to reduce some of the biases that creep up.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as Elizabeth noted early on, it's an ongoing thing. So a couple of questions in the chat. I'll get to one, and then we're going to move on to pay transparency and pay explainability, because that's also a big topic right now. So the question is, for organizations that don't use performance ratings and still have pay for performance philosophy, what data have you used to analyze equitable pay for performance decisions? I'll answer just from the perspective of what we see across our customers, which is really all the same data you have currently. So without ratings, to your question, it's things like, depending on the company and the philosophy, location, geography, tenure, time and role, experience, maybe age as a proxy for experience, education level, sometimes job, family, whatever you have in your data that you're consistently using in terms of a discipline methodology in terms of why you pay what you pay. So it's really all the things that you use currently, and this is what, you know, our software helps our customers use this and measure whatever they have in their data in terms of what's actually driving pay. But curious what you all would say in terms of, to the question for organizations that don't have ratings, because there's so many questions about eliminating ratings, but still want to have that pay for performance philosophy or culture. Any other thoughts or anecdotes on that before we move to pay explainability?
I have not worked in an organization that has not had a formal performance rating management system. So I have to, I'm going to give this just based on some of the research that I did when it was such a big trend in terms of going ratingless and it was first coming out. One of the cons that I was starting to read up on was that sometimes companies do then create a shadow rating system. So they don't have a formal one that they communicate because they want to get rid of the emotion on the label. But somewhere behind the scenes, they were actually somehow measuring their employees. Now, for certain types of roles, this can be easy. So for example, if you are a consultant and billable hours is one of your core items to be measured on, potentially maybe that was an area that you could create this. So I'm not necessarily a fan, but I think, you know, Maria, besides your answer, that was one other area that I had noted in some of my research.
Great. And there's so much interest on this. So I definitely think our team, we're going to further this discussion. So stay tuned, just based on the chat and the interest and the fact that we can't even possibly get to all of your questions. We will definitely do some sort of follow-up on the topic. So again, thank you. I want to pivot to sort of one last topic area, and that's really about pay transparency. So in this, you know, we kind of call it the era of pay transparency, whether you're referring to the salary laws that are coming out and accelerating across the country. More than a fifth of workers are now covered by some sort of pay transparency legislation in the US, but also now the passage of the EU directive on pay transparency. There's a bunch more things around disclosure of career progression, things around the unadjusted gap that are all coming for global companies. One of the biggest challenges for companies is they have to now have pay explainability, meaning they have to be able to explain why they pay what they pay. So if you say pay for performance, you need to be able to clearly articulate what it means and prove that it's true. So how should companies think about the broader communication of their performance management process? Any thoughts or stories about this? And even, you know, feel free to include failures if you've been in a situation where you've done or seen a company do this poorly, and how did they fix it? So really anything up for grabs.
I just think pay transparency has caused companies to have to really reflect, as you said, Maria, on what factors actually influence their pay decisions. And I've certainly seen it, a lot of the companies I've been at since this, you know, swell of activity in the space has happened, is we're just seeing much tighter alignment of pay for role in base salary. And I actually think directionally that's the right way to go. I also think, though, and we're seeing it in the chat, it's putting pressure on what do you mean to pay for performance then? You know, is it target comp for target performance? You achieve the goals that you set out for yourself? Is it that you achieve the core competencies of your job description? And does pay for performance really now morph into, we're going to pay for outperformance? We're going to find that 15% of our workforce that went above and beyond, or in a behavior way, showed up above and beyond and demonstrated our culture and our behaviors. And I think it's forcing companies to have a real discussion about what they stand for, what behaviors matter to them, and what results go above and beyond. And I know currently we're in the process of really asking ourselves at Corebridge, are we simply rewarding too many of our top graded folks? Shouldn't the expectations rise as your seniority increases, as you move up the chain? And almost should it be even more challenging to outperform when you're one of our most senior leaders? And I think that those conversations are giving us all really good insights into what we want to stand for and what pay for performance really means at our company.
Those are great nuggets. Thank you so much. Other thoughts on pay transparency, pay explainability?
Yeah, I can, I love this topic, one, because we're, transparency is actually a value within the studio. So I realized that the way I'm going to talk about this is it's very cultural from our organization standpoint. Our folks kind of demand that we're transparent in all of the actions that we take. When it comes to pay transparency, we started to align to the mandate, as you were speaking about, Maria, for Washington State. Right on January 1, we had to have that information revealed. But the other piece to that is upon hire, every single one of our employees is provided with information of the who, what, where, when, why, how of their pay. Have a direct line to my colleague, right? And the rest of the team as far as compensation is concerned. And the other way that we're ensuring pay transparency, and very, very proud to talk about, is we work with Syndio, of course, on our pay equity certificate, and earned a certification that says that we will commit to reviewing all of our pay actions on a yearly basis and ensuring that that we are in keeping with pay equity and how that looks for our organization today. So that's another way that we are talking about it, that we're also being very intentional and ensuring that the rest of the organization knows where they stand individually, but also the rest of the organization, and where there are discrepancies and where there are gaps, committing to rectifying that. And communicating that out, because it's one thing for myself and the rest of the leadership team to see where those gaps are, where those discrepancies, and make certain tweaks on the back end. But if we're not explaining to the studio, if we're not talking to individuals about the steps that we're taking and that we're committed to taking, then it's a moot point. So we're very, very dedicated to that. I love that question.
Thank you, Courtney. Lynn, thoughts on that?
So just very quickly, I will interject, as we too are on our pay transparency journey, and we have achieved, our fair pay certification as well. What I would say for those companies that are just starting out on this journey is that you can be intentional about it and to also bite it off in stages. So you don't have to go from 0 to 100 all at the same time. We took our own steps in terms of our pay equity journey, and now in terms of our pay transparency journey. And the great thing about us doing the work now is that we're getting ahead of some of these laws and regulations. In fact, we got our certification completed just right before California went out with its pay transparency laws. And so that honestly helped us to push us along there. And now we're starting to take a look at it from a global perspective. But it puts you more in the driver's seat if you start to do the work now. So I would definitely recommend that to everyone out there who's maybe just starting to think about this journey.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so last question, we'll do a speed round because we only have 2 minutes left. Would love sort of best advice, worst advice when it comes to thinking about moving forward. You already know the audience really has a lot of questions about rating lists. The audience has a lot of questions about calibration, a lot of questions about starting pay. So give us your quick best advice, worst advice when thinking about how to improve, obviously, since 51% are not happy with their performance management. So let's just go around the horn. Courtney, why don't we start with you?
Oh my gosh, on the spot. Best advice. I think I've said it a million times. I'm going to keep saying it. Management capability. Invest in that. Be intentional in that. It's super, super critical because that certainly trickles down. Worst advice, oh gosh, that's a hard one. Worst advice is to do nothing. Worst advice is to assume that everything is perfect. That is not an iterative process. It absolutely is. So keep the work up if you're truly dedicated to ensuring that folks are satisfied with the process and that your organizational goals are being met.
Awesome. Lynn, how about you?
Best advice, actually just ripping on what I said previously, start working on this now, but also do it in stages. So again, you don't need to go from 0 to 100. And I will actually copy Courtney on the worst advice is don't sit there and do nothing. So you need to continue to work on this, progress on it as a company. It's important, not only from a pay perspective, but from a career opportunity perspective. And that's important to your people.
Awesome. Elizabeth, you are the final word.
Gosh, best advice is action. I think, again, the antidote to the unconscious is to be conscious about it. So I think all of this being a topic is the best advice. The worst advice is, yeah, we'll take a look at that next year. So I think the time is now. We don't ignore this anymore. You got to just get to work on it.
You three, I mean, that probably set a record for the most audience engagement on a webinar that we've ever done, and we've been doing these for 4 years. So thank you so much. I think part of that is just the caliber of our panelists today and the fact that you all come with such deep expertise, but from 3 different vantage points. So thank you so much. And audience, we will be following up with the deck, and you may see a round 2 with these same folks. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.